Okay, I'll turn down the volume a little bit, maybe deal with the feedback issue, but otherwise I think we're ready to go. Looks like most of you are getting the audio pretty clear. Good. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. This is Basic Networking Utilities 2. Just by the sound of it, it is in fact a sequel. Last summer we conducted a session called Basic Networking Utilities, and it was a pretty popular topic. I think a lot of people got something out of it, so we decided to create a sequel. This is a quick review. So what did we do last summer? We had a forum exactly like this one, and we demonstrated and talked about a number of command line utilities that are used in networking. And what you see in front of you is a bulleted list of what those commands were. If you're interested in that session, part one, which was last summer, you can find a recording on mcnc.org, and you can watch the full video and audio of that presentation. So these were the commands we went over the last time, and they were sort of old school. These are kind of the classical networking utilities that probably all of us use at one time or another, and we talked about situations where we would use them and what their most common uses are. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. It's just we're going to focus on a new set of commands, and it's going to be a little less old school, I guess, and a little more modern. And as a result of that, the commands are going to look and behave a little bit differently. In that session last summer, we finished with a command that you see here in red that was called netsh. And we talked about how that was probably what a lot of us are going to be using in the future. So it was a forward-looking component to last summer's presentation. And it's sort of like in the movies when they introduce a plot twist or a new character in the last few minutes. You kind of know that there's going to be a sequel that's going to follow, a part two, and that's what this session is. It's a sequel. It's a part two. So that and that netsh that we touched on last summer is going to get a lot more attention this time around. So netsh was sort of like sort of Darth Vader spinning off into the distance, but his TIE fighter never really exploding. You just knew there was going to be a sequel after that. And that's what we're going to do today. So these are the commands I chose for today. They focus on, one is old and one is new. I should start by saying that. One is the net command, one is the netsh command. And we're going to look at a variety of different ways to use them. The net command in a Windows environment's been around for a long time, and its uses. There's a lot of uses for it, but I'm going to, as I always do, I'm going to go over the situations where I use it most often, and situations where I think you'll use it most often as well. netsh, as I talked about a few minutes ago, or just a minute ago, it's future forward-looking. There's a lot of neat things it does, and we only touched on one of them last summer. So in this session, we're going to demonstrate use of the netsh command in a variety of ways. So again, why use the command line? Well, it's quick and it's easy, and all different platforms have a command line, and you don't need to load a GUI, and especially when you're working on machines that are remote and perhaps you're working on them across a wide area network, you don't have to worry about bandwidth and lag and things like that. But the main reasons for using the command line, it's quick and it's easy. In Windows, we open a command shell with command.exe. We can also create a shortcut to it. We can run either command.exe or the shortcut as an administrator. Sometimes we need to do that. We're going to see an example of that in a couple minutes where we stop a service, and user level privileges typically will not let you do that. If we create a shortcut, as many of you know, that becomes a PIF or a PIF file. And one of the nice things we can do with a PIF file is we can configure it to always run as an administrator. So that's something to keep in mind when you create shortcuts to these things. It can run as an administrator without adding the credentials. So I thought we would start with the net command. And the net command does, as I said, it does a variety of things. One of the most common things it's used for is to stop and start services. And I was going to do a demonstration of that, and then because of something that happened to me recently, I thought I would give one of my an example, I guess, a demonstration of one way in which I commonly use this command. So the net command stops and starts services. So one example of that is it can stop the DHCP client. And why would we ever do that? Well, we want to refresh our DHCP address that's been handed out to us. Might be one example. Or we had some kind of problem in the negotiation of DHCP. So one way to deal with that is to shut the interface off and turn it on again. Another way, as an example here, is the net command, which will allow us to stop and start the DHCP service. So I have another example of stopping and starting a service with the net command, and that is in the case of printer problems. I don't know about you, but I have always felt like printers, as sort of a subject area, absorb an incredible percentage of our time as network administrators or as IT administrators even. And that seems to have always been the case. That you could go back 10 years and that was the case. We just seem to always spend a disproportionate amount of time on printing issues. And I was visiting one of the LEAs a couple months ago, and while we were meeting and working on a project, we got distracted by printer problems several times, and it was a couple of users that seemed to send print jobs and not get any output, resend the print job, and run into a problem and call the help desk. So I showed this group what I have always done with that problem. And one of the things I do is I stop and clear the print spool. And so these commands here, they do just that. So we might say, for example, net stop spooler. And there's an example of where I need to run with higher privileges. So I'm going to open a new command prompt as an administrator and type that command again. And at this point, once I have the print spool service stopped, I'm going to delete all of the print jobs that are in that spool folder. And that folder is typically in the Windows path, spool, printers, and then I put a star at the end for delete because typically there's several jobs that have been waiting, and if we don't clear them out, it's going to be one of those situations where we unplug and replug the printer in or something like that, and 12 copies of the same printout is going to come through. So after we delete that, we then start the spool service again. So I would have entered in my delete command for the spool folder, and then that net command comes up again, and I restart the print service. And 9 times out of 10, this is all that needed to be done to get that person printing again. The problem is they call the help desk every time this occurs, and we have to keep redoing these commands. And so I wanted to give an example to this group at this particular LEA, and then I decided later I would include it in today's presentation, that allows you to give the user this ability but without necessarily having to touch their desktop every time they had that problem. And we can do that if we put these commands, everything that you see in this box, and because you'll be able to download this PowerPoint later on, you can just copy what's in this box and do this yourself. But we can put all these commands into what we call a batch file. And a batch file in Windows is just a file, a text file that we create in Notepad that has either the batch extension, BAT, or the command extension, CMD. Either one will work exactly the same. And we put all of those commands we just talked about into the batch file. So let's see what that looks like. So anything that starts with these colons is ignored. It's just a place for us to put comments. And as we said, we stop the spooler. Once the spooler is stopped, we clear out all of those files in the spool folder. And then once the batch file is finished clearing those files out, it starts up the spool service again. And because I'm always worried about something going wrong, I put an extra command in here called pause, just so I can see any errors or problems that the batch file had. So let's watch that run. So here's the three commands that the batch file tried to do. It tried to stop the spooler, and it got that access denied error. It tried to delete, which usually isn't a problem, is not a permissions problem. It tried to delete the files in the printer's spool folder. And of course, when it started the service again, it got that same error. So all that means is I have to run that as an administrator. And that's easy enough to do. I can right click and I can say run as administrator. And this thing works perfectly every single time, but that's not really all that helpful, because I don't want to have to go to every person's desk and run this as an administrator again each time they have a problem. But you can see that once you have those elevated privileges on the command line, all these commands work just fine. And at the end, it pauses and waits for my any key to continue so I can see whether or not it had any problems. So what about that? Well, the privileges issue, many years ago wasn't an issue at all. Everybody had the same level of privileges. But now, of course, that is something to be concerned about, because after all, we don't want to have to touch that person's machine, walk over to their desk, or drive over to their location every time this issue pops up. So we want to run this as an administrator all the time. It's important to note that if you are going to start putting some of these utilities into a batch file, that Windows does not let you run a batch or CMD, BAT or CMD file as an administrator with stored credentials. It will, however, let you do that to a shortcut or a PIF file. So if you just create a shortcut to that batch and go to its properties rather than the batch file itself, you have the advanced option of always running as an administrator. And now that user can run this command by themselves whenever they have a problem without calling the help desk each and every time. So that's the net command and how it's used for stopping and starting services. I'm just going to check the chat window here. Okay, remember to use the chat window if you want to make any comments or questions, or I'll be checking that periodically. I remember the first time I did one of the webinar sessions, I think I went through the whole hour and didn't check the chat window until the very end. So I don't want to make that mistake this time. So that was the net command for stopping and starting a service. Another really common way I use the net command is to map a drive. And in an Active Directory environment, that of course can be done through group policies and settings. But in the net command allows me to do it, first of all, when I don't have a shared directory service like Active Directory. And it allows me to do it without using the GUI, which is also nice. But it also, as we did a minute ago, it allows me to put a set of commands that involve mapping a drive into a batch file. And that's helpful too sometimes. For example, when I want a backup process to run at night, but I don't want the user to have that drive mapped all the time. The netuse command allows me to schedule a backup whereby the drive gets mapped for the purpose of uploading files, let's say, during a backup process, but then it allows me to disconnect that drive before the user comes back the next day and is using their desktop. So let's see how that works. It's pretty straightforward. The commands, there's an example of the commands on this slide. But typically we're saying something like netuse, and we're picking a drive letter. And then we're referring to the path where that share exists. Something like that. And if that requires credentials, we can type in a username and password. If not, if it's sort of like a public share, then we won't get prompted for any credentials. But now I have access to that drive, and the user can upload, assuming they have permissions, they can upload. Your backup process can complete, and when finished, I can disconnect the drive using the net command as in much the same way. So I can say netuse again, and again refer to the drive letter, and this time I'm going to disconnect, which in the world of the netuse command is actually del, not disconnect or something like that. And del does not delete anything on the drive, it just disconnects the user from that mapped drive. So how would that look in an automated process? Well, I've got an example here of a command, a set of commands in a batch file, and they do the same thing. This batch file will map that same drive automatically, and it can be run as a scheduled service. So, for example, I can check to see if the T drive is already mapped, and if it is, I can skip any further processing or skip the mapping of the drive. And then I can check to see if it doesn't exist, I can execute the command that we just did, and I can map that drive automatically. Now, the nice thing about putting this in a batch file is I can also specify the user. I can even specify the password. So if it's a shared path that requires elevated privileges, I can put those privileges right here in the batch file. And you might be thinking, well, but if the user can just open this batch file in Notepad, they're going to be able to see the administrative password, which is something we don't obviously want them to be able to do. What this batch file does, though, and I'll make it available, is it lets you pass the password sort of invisibly. So if you look at, for example, if you were to look at Task Scheduler and you were to look at what does a task look like when you are setting it up on the user's machine, you set it for a time, and then you specify the path to the batch file, but you're also allowed to pass an argument. And if you, through local policy manager, if you disable users from getting to the task scheduler, you can effectively hide the password in here and pass it to the batch file, and run the command with elevated privileges, and the user never actually sees the administrative password. To come up with an example for that, I did that very same thing here. This is a PIF, or a shortcut to the batch, and as a command line argument, it inserts the password. So this is similar to using the task scheduler. And if I run that, it completes successfully using the username and password that are needed to map that drive. So that's netuse in the form of mapping drives. Now there's other purposes of netuse. I should say there's other purposes to the net command. Stopping and starting services and mapping network drives are not the only reasons we use the net command. They're just the most common ones for me. A couple things to remember as far as services. Net start by itself will list all the services running on the machine. So that's net start, if you remember, is what we use to start a service or stop a service, the net stop command. But just typing it without the service name itself will just list all the services for you. And if you want to stop and start any of the services you see, just remember that if there are spaces in the service name, you will need to put that service in quotes. So for example, if I were to stop my DHCP client, I would have to put quotes around it like that in order to accommodate there being spaces in the service name. And what about netuse? If we don't have any arguments that we pass to the netuse command, it just tells us all the map drives that are currently on this system. So we mapped that T drive through that batch file, and it remembered that. Obviously, it's still mapped, and it lists it here if we type in the netuse command by itself. If you want that drive mapping to be persistent, remember the format of the netuse command was the drive name followed by the path and followed by perhaps you want to specify the username. You can also specify that it's persistent. And that will give the user access to the drive whenever the machine reboots. In other words, Windows is going to remember that drive mapping in the future. Okay, that's it for net start, net stop, and netuse. Okay. So we talked about netsh, and netsh is this new set of tools derived from the PowerShell environment that allow us to do a lot of neat things. And the older versions of Windows didn't have netsh. netsh does not exist on, for example, a Mac operating system or a Linux operating system. It's specific to Windows, but it does a lot of neat things. And on my Windows laptops, these are the things I find myself using it for most often. So what can we get from the netsh command? One thing it can tell us is a computer's IP address. So netsh, and in this case we're telling netsh to work with the interfaces, or the network interfaces, and specifically we're saying show us the current configuration. And we get a lot of output there because we have more than one interface. So just like we did in part 1 of basic networking utilities, we can pipe the command to more, which causes the screen to pause. And we can press spacebar and go through the output of the command one screen full at a time. And we can see here that it provides us with an IP address or any other network configuration parameter. And we can capture that if we want to. We can, of course, it's visible on the screen. We'll get that information in front of us without having to click through the GUI, which with each version of Windows, that seems to take longer and longer to get to that. And we can also just get the information that we want. We can tell netsh to effectively filter its output because we don't need to see all of that if we're trying to troubleshoot a networking issue. We may just want to know what subnet we're on. So in that case, we tell netsh to use the interfaces and show us their IP config. But this time, rather than piping it to more and enabling our spacebar to sort of control the screen flow, this time we're going to pipe it to another command called find a string. And let's say we're interested in the IP address. In other words, we only want to see that. The find string will filter everything out except for lines that start with IP address. And so now we get output like that. And I'm going to clear the screen just so you can see the difference. We get an output that's, if we're trying to diagnose an issue related to the IP address, this is a lot more helpful. In fact, it would be even better if we could get rid of the local host address. And so this is the command I use most often. I get rid of the local host as well, and now I get just the IP address that that machine is using on my local network. So netsh does a lot of things, and we're going to go over several more, the most useful ones that I use. But as you're going to see, the ability to filter the output is going to be necessary at times, let's just say, because the output of the netsh commands is, especially when you get into wireless, well, let's just say there's a great deal of output and you're only looking for a specific thing, or you want to pipe that value into a text file. And this is something I will commonly do in batch files like we talked about a minute ago. But once this is done, I now have a text file in my temp folder that is storing the IP address for this machine. And that path could have been a server share. It could have included the host name. And then I would have a record of which machines are using which IP addresses. So we could have started by saying host name, which just does that. It just prints out the host name. This a batch file could have piped that to my little log file here called IP address. It could have followed with the IP address output that we got a second ago. And now my little log file says, let me change that. My log file will say exactly what I'm looking for, which is I want to know the name of the machine, and I want to be able to see its IP address and have, if this is a shared path, I can even have all my machines in a lab log the IP addresses that they're using. If they're static, I'm not going to see that in a DHCP server. And then I have a record of it. Host name and the IP address. And again, you can filter out any aspect of the IP config that you want to know about. So for example, I was recently at an LEA and we did some subnetting work, and this very same set of commands allowed us to see which labs had the old subnet mask that had to be changed and which ones had the new subnet masks, and we didn't have to modify them. So netsh does a lot of useful things. You can actually set the IP address. Here I have an example of not necessarily changing the static IP address, but setting the address to be DHCP. So again, I'm thinking of that same LEA where we were doing some subnetting work, and we had several labs set up all with static IPs, and because that caused so much extra work to have to touch nearly every machine, we just in our startup batch file, we just entered this command, which set the local area connection, and we refer to that by name within quotes, and the keyword DHCP, which changed all those machines to get a dynamic IP rather than continue to use the static IP they already had. And because this was done in a batch file, all we had to do was reboot, and those machines got these new settings. Just remember, if you change the, as you can probably remember from doing this using the GUI, if you change the IP settings for a Windows machine to DHCP, it's a separate setting to change DNS or get DNS from the DHCP server. So there's actually separate commands for DNS and the Windows Internet Naming Service in the netsh interface. So you want to make sure that you do all three of these. You want to make sure that you set the IP address to DHCP, and you want to make sure that you set DNS to be gathered from DHCP, and you want to make sure that if you use WINS, the Windows Internet Naming Service, you want to make sure that you get those settings from DHCP as well. Okay. I had a pause there to check the chat window. Remember to use the chat window if you want me to stop or go over something a second time, or if you just have questions or something like that. Okay, excellent. Okay, netsh. A common way I use netsh is not only with the interface subset of commands, but with another subset called WLAN. And WLAN, as you can see here, it deals with wireless. And it will tell me a whole host of parameters about the wireless settings and the current wireless status of that Windows machine. So you might remember from last summer, we did something like WLAN. Remember in our previous examples, it was interface because we're dealing with the interface subset of commands, which is where we interact with the wired interface typically. But here we're dealing with wireless, and so we start with netsh WLAN to enable the wireless family or suite of commands that are available. And there's a lot, as we said, there's a lot of information here. So if we just were to say show all, and in a screen sharing environment, I'm not sure if you actually saw how much information there was there. So this time I'm going to pipe it to more. And there's a lot of information here in the show all output that can tell you a lot about your current wireless connection. You will see not only the current status, you will see all of the network profiles that are being stored on that laptop. So if you were on a public Wi-Fi SSID a couple weeks ago, that's been stored by the Windows your Windows user profile, you're going to see it here, at least the parts that Windows remembers about that network. Well, so which is a long way of saying everything you've ever done in wireless is probably stored here. So I'm going to go over what do I typically use this for. I typically don't, although it is sort of interesting to see all the different public hotspots that a user has been to. That's not typically what I'm using the netsh command for. Typically, I want to get specific pieces of information, like I want to know, like this slide says, which access point, and I'm assuming we're in an environment where we have more than one access point, but which one am I actually using? So if one user is saying, you know, the network is really slow, and the other users in that, let's say that same classroom, are not complaining that the network is slow, it might be helpful to find what is different about the slower user's experience. And the first place I look is to see what access point they're connected to. So netsh is really good for that. It has a show interfaces command. And that show interfaces command includes things like the BSSID, and which in this particular case I'm using wired, so I'm going to go back here. So here's an example of using netsh to find what access point am I actually connected to. So if I pause here, you can see that when the wireless interface is active, the netsh command gives us a lot of information. It tells us what is the current SSID that we're connected to. So I suppose that might be the first thing we want to verify for that user who's having a problem is, are they actually on the right SSID and not some rogue network or neighboring network that was open and they accidentally associated with. But specifically, I was looking for which access point are they connected to, and so netsh shows us that information. And if that's all we want to see, we can actually filter the output again with that find string command, and we will see just the BSSID information. So again, pipe it, find string, we get nothing but the MAC address of the access point. And similarly, another thing I check for, and we did this last summer, what channel are they using? That's helpful because, for one thing, the channel can tell me whether or not they are on 2.4 gigahertz or are they on 5 gigahertz. And they may be unique in that way. They may be the only user that has a dual band interface, and so there's some issue with our 5 gig network. They may be the only user that doesn't have a dual band interface, and in fact this is more likely the case. They're the only ones using the 2.4 spectrum, and there is interference in that spectrum, and that would be the reason that they were having a slow network experience in comparison to everyone else. So in a Windows environment, netsh can drill down to specifically which BSSID, which access point they're connected to, and which channel they're using, and some other information as well. But these are the most common things I look for, and that helps me identify what may be the cause of that user's experience. So another cool thing that netsh will do is, and anybody who's ever gotten a new laptop might be interested in this, but it's come up, and I have found it useful in several different scenarios. netsh will actually let you export a profile for a wireless network, and that includes, let's say, the pre-shared key, and it'll let you dump it into a file, and you can then also later import it. So you can export it from your old machine and import it to your new machine. Or in the case of where you don't have a lot of infrastructure, you have a lot of standalone laptops, you can actually bulk import or have everyone import the same file so that they will all have the same wireless profile that you need them to have. So in netsh, that command is called export. And curiously, it is, let me get back to that slide. Curiously, it is called add when we want to add the profile back to another machine. So I think that's confusing for a lot of people. Why, the logical thing to call this would have been import when we are taking that file and importing essentially the wireless network profile. But no, Microsoft decided to call it add. So keep these slides, and you'll never get the two confused. So here's how we dump the network that we want to use on a new machine, or that we want to give to a set of new machines. This is netsh at work on a machine that has a wireless interface active, and in this case it's a staff SSID, and I want everyone to get the staff SSID, but I don't want to have to touch every laptop and click through entering the pre-shared key and things like that. So in this case, there was in fact an SSID called staff, and it dumped it into a specific folder with the extension XML. And that's because if you look in the command, I was able to specify that I wanted the export to go to a particular folder. So that's the current user on their desktop. And it uses the interface name followed by the SSID, and as we said before, the extension XML. And if we open that in Notepad, it looks something like this. It has obviously the SSID name, the authentication type or the pre-shared key type, the method of encryption, and it also includes the key. So you may want to be careful about where you or how you handle this XML file, because it does contain the key, although it has been encrypted because the protected parameter was set to true. But now we have that wireless profile in a file that we can propagate to as many machines as we want. It can even be scripted. It can be part of a login script, kind of like everything we've done here. If everybody points to a shared startup script or startup folder, these are all processes we can put and into that shared path and have them executed on every machine, even when we don't have a complete directory services structure like Active Directory to manage that for us. But this is what that file looks like. And now we have an example of adding that file to the new machine. So again, it's netsh. We're dealing with the wireless LAN subset. We're going to add, not import, but add a profile. And we're going to point to, now in this case, we're pointing to a shared folder. The file name is given a path that is actually on a shared folder. So this is ideal for an environment where we want a fleet of machines or laptops to get this wireless profile, to import it automatically, but we don't necessarily want to touch every machine and do this process. Although this is fairly automated in itself and pretty quick, this will, we can save even more time by putting this in a shared path. And so the positive result is that the profile has been added to that machine, and that network is now usable. And in the cases I've used this, we can even disable the existing SSID that the machines were using, and they will automatically connect to the new staff SSID. But the one thing to remember about that is these files potentially contain the pre-shared key for those networks. So we want to be careful how we handle that, and where we put those files and such like that. Okay, that takes me to my last slide. I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions or something I can clarify for everyone. Go ahead and use the chat window if there's anything you want to ask that we can go over again. So we started out with the net command. And we said that it was capable of stopping and starting services. We gave the example of stopping the spooler, clearing all the print jobs that were causing, and typically there's one job that is a corrupt file that's causing the print queue to halt, and that we can clear those out, restart the spooler service, and that all of that can be put into a batch file that sits on the user's desktop, and now they can clear those clear that print queue themselves without calling the help desk. So that's a common. The other common use I have for the net start and stop commands is to restart the DHCP client. So I'm going to see if I can. I can't get that to play. I was going to play a video for that, but let's see if Chrome will play that. So in this example, and again, this is like a review of the net start stop command. I'm going to show what that kind of looks like, and it's one of those commands you cannot demonstrate while you're doing an online presentation, because the execution of that command on the machine that you are using to do the presentation will suddenly go offline. So I made a video of this. As you probably noticed, some of the other commands were videos as well for that very same reason. But I have two windows open here, and the window below is sending a continuous ping across the network just to show you that I have connectivity. And in the window above, I am typing out the command that I want to demonstrate. And you'll notice, as we said before, in net stop, when there are spaces in the service, we put it in quotes. But the reason I wanted to show you this video is be aware that you may, when you stop one service, because other services may be dependent on it, you may in effect have to stop other services as well. And so that's what we see happening here. And Windows assumes that we don't want to do that, but we type a Y. And then the net stop command will automatically stop in the proper order all those services until it finally gets to the where it's going to stop the DHCP client, which is why we're here in the first place. And once it stops the DHCP client, you'll notice that my network connectivity in the window below drops. I no longer have network connectivity. The DHCP client has stopped. DHCP has to be renegotiated. But then, because it's an automatic service in Windows, the DHCP client automatically restarts, and my network connectivity is restored. As you saw at the bottom, I got network connectivity back. So just be aware that stopping and starting a service is definitely something you want to test before you just deploy it in something like a batch file, because some services may be dependent on others, and you may be stopping more than just the service you are thinking of at that time. We also talked about netuse, and netuse is a way of mapping drives. Netuse by itself shows us if we have any drives currently mapped. And disconnecting a drive is simple as just referring to the drive letter and saying del. And we showed that all of that can be done in a batch file in the case of where we perhaps want to schedule a backup process. And we do that. We don't want to try to map a drive if it's already been mapped, so we say if exist. If the drive currently exists, continue on with your backup process or whatever it is you want this batch file to do. But if it does not exist, if that drive has not been mapped, then go ahead and issue the map, the netuse command to map that drive, and then you can continue on with whatever processing or copying of files that you wanted to do. And at the end, once the copy commands are complete, we can, of course, say netuse. We don't need the null. Delete. And when the user comes back in the morning, that drive is not there, and that's particularly good if it's a mobile device like a laptop. We don't want the Windows Explorer searching for that drive all the time and slowing the machine down. I got a question. Let me. Okay, so I've got a question. Are these commands for the user's computer, or are they able to remotely find other devices on the network? Well, finding something like a network projector on the network, which you refer to there, for that I would go back and look at part 1 of this presentation from last summer. We did more things like that. Since these are Windows, mostly Windows-based commands, they are, if they're going to operate or manage a remote device, it too is going to have to be a Windows device. So a projector would not fit in that category. For example, the netuse command, if you ever read the help for the net command itself, I should say, and it has a funny way of requiring that the help syntax comes first. But it can actually stop and start services on remote machines. So that's something really helpful. You can stop and start the service on a remote machine, assuming that your local privileges have access rights to the local machine, the ability to stop and start services on the local machine. That can be very helpful. I can remember managing a whole fleet of web servers that ran on Windows, and because of the net stop set of commands, I could actually stop and start the remote web service when it froze up, which in those days was very common. So referring to the machine with a double slash allows you to actually manage or execute the command remotely. netsh, and in fact all of the, or most of, I should say, most of the PowerShell utilities, they also have the ability to run on a remote machine. But again, always keep in mind when you're talking about running any set of commands, old school commands like netstart, netstop, new school, if you will, commands like netsh, you have to have the appropriate level of privileges on that remote machine. And then just to go back to our review, we talked about netsh. We did some demos on finding an IP address, using the filter. And again, anytime you're using this find string filter, if you have spaces in what you want to filter on, make sure you put it in quotes. So in the example here, we ran all the IP config output. We did a find string to filter out just the IP address. And then we did a final find string to remove from the IP addresses, remove the local host. If there's spaces, you're going to need quotes. In this case, there's an example here of how to change machines to DHCP using netsh. And the caution there is make sure that if you want them to get DNS and the Windows Internet Naming Service servers from DHCP as well, those are actually 2 extra commands. They're all listed here, but you have a total of 3 commands to completely change a client to DHCP. netsh provides a wealth of information about the wireless settings and status of a Windows machine. In these examples, we saw what all that information was, but we also filtered out specifically finding the current access point that machine is using, and also finding the Wi-Fi channel that particular machine is using. And just as a bonus here, I included how I do that on Mac operating systems as well. And then finally, we took an SSID, or a wireless network profile. We dumped it into an XML file, into a folder of our choice. And then later, we imported that into a machine so that now that new machine has the same wireless profile as the original. And that's a good way to, and again, in an unmanaged environment where you don't have all of the clients reporting to a management server, a mobile device management system, or a directory service like Active Directory, this is a great way to propagate the new SSID that you're, let's say, going to be using in the fall. Are there any other questions I can answer while we have time left? I can, of course, stay online if there are any questions. You should be able to see my email address there. You also see the K-12 landing page where you can find a recording of this session. You can also find a recording of all of the previous webinars that have been done. And you can that includes the Basic Networking Utilities Part 1 from last summer. Okay, so I'm not getting questions. I'm getting thank yous, which are really nice. There is a survey, I think, that goes out for each of these sessions, so it would help a lot if everybody filled out the survey and said how awesome it was. I mean, especially tying in the Star Wars reference. So, that was worth something, right? I want to thank everyone for coming. It's been a lot of fun.